Today we will hear from Armin Eschraghi, who was born in Iran and raised in Germany. He has a master's degree in Islamic studies from Goethe University in Frankfurt, and also a PhD from there. He currently teaches at the Sankt Georgen School of Theology and Philosophy, which is a Jesuit institution, and also at Goethe University here in Frankfurt. He has published quite a lot about the Bab and Shaykhis and such. He's published a monograph on Epistle of the Son of a Wolf. He completed his doctoral dissertation on the tablet he'll be speaking about today, on the tablet on the special prophethood of Muhammad. And he is also helping to translate the high writings into German. So that's our introduction to Armin today. Armin, welcome to the Wilmette Institute's Web Talk. We're very grateful for you to be offering this to us, and we're looking forward to hearing from you.
Thank you very much, dear Rob. Thank you for giving me this opportunity to speak on this topic. It was a good opportunity to go back and read what I had written in the early 2000s, and it's always interesting and instructive in a way to go back and read what one has written in the past. I'm always reminded of there's a quotation by Shaykhi Effendi which says that there's no limit to the study of the cause. The more we study the writings, the more insight or knowledge we will gain, and the more we will discover that our previous held notions were mistaken. So it's always good to go back and read stuff that one has written earlier on and reconsider it and discover mistakes or inconsistencies and so on. And I thank you also for this opportunity to revisit some of the research I have done a while ago. There was a talk by Stephen Phelps a few weeks ago that I listened to, which I highly recommend to anyone interested in the writings of the Bab. And he mentions the volume of the Bab's writings that has survived. And that, if I remember correctly, he says that about just 1% of those writings, roughly 1%, has been translated. And I could add to that this 1% also is the same number that applies to those that have been edited and published. So even in Persian and Arabic, in the original languages, we do not have access to more than, officially, sort of as authorized official translations by any Baha'i agency, we don't have more access to more writings than we actually have in English and in translation. So this is not really a privilege for the Persian and Arabic speaking friends in this case. We divide the writings of the Bab. If you look at it, it's a relatively short period of time where these writings were revealed. From May 1844 to his martyrdom in July 1850, that's roughly 6 years. And if you add 1 or 2 years, maybe earlier, before the Bab revealed his claim to Mullah Hussein, he also had revealed a number of writings, but not very many. Anyway, it's less than a decade that the Bab's ministry lasted, and still he has such a voluminous body of writings. And even though it's a short period, we usually divide it into individual periods, sub-periods, if you wish. And there's different ideas, different concepts that have been proposed, suggested. The easiest one is to speak of early writings and of later writings. And we would say early writings would be anything revealed during the Bab's stay in Shiraz and in Isfahan. So up until the first half of 1847, this will be what I will refer to today as early writings of the Bab. And the later writings would be anything revealed in Marku and later on after the Persian Bayan. Because the Persian Bayan, the mother book of the Bab, is, as you all know, is a major shift in the Bab's progressive revelation, revealing his doctrine and his teachings and so on. From there on, the writings of the Bab have a very different character and tone and so on. But today I speak about the early period. And of course, I think Nader Saidi has also suggested that Isfahan should be sort of a middle period, and all that also, of course, makes perfect sense. But for the sake of brevity, today I just refer to early writings as that. Now, these early writings of the Bab are almost unanimously written or revealed in reply to questions, to inquiries. The writings of the Bab are mainly correspondence with believers or letters, tablets written to prominent people whom the Bab decided he should make his claim known to them. And they were mainly clerics, mainly from Shaykhi background, but not exclusively. So this is why the topics in these early writings are mainly Islamic topics, if you wish, interpreting Qur'anic chapters, surahs, or verses, or sometimes just expressions or words, Quranic words, or sometimes even individual letters. Also, there are a number of explanations of Hadith, so-called Hadith. These are sayings attributed to the Prophet of Islam, or to, in the Shiite context, to the Imáms, which are the male offspring of Muhammad. As we all know, this is unique to Shiite Islam, that they believe that divine guidance was continued after the death of Muhammad through the line of the Imáms, his male offspring. So sayings attributed to them or to the Prophet himself, they have also been commented on by the Bab whenever he was asked about it. And also, of course, about the classical questions of philosophy and theology, free will, determination, the eternity of creation, God's omniscience. These are classical themes that have been debated over decades and centuries in Islamic circles, and the Bab, of course, has also been asked about these, and he has written about them. And last but not least, the so-called occult traditions, things like alchemy and numerology, letter symbolism, talismanic devices, and even medicine. Well, that's not an occult tradition, but in this context, it fits in that topic. So it's interesting how the outward form of revelation and its language, to some extent, is shaped by the addressees, in the sense that it was these addressees that provided an occasion for the Bab to reveal whatever he wrote, he revealed. If they hadn't asked these questions, then probably the Bab would not have revealed, say, a commentary on the Surah of Al-Kawthar, Surah 108. He probably would have said the same, he would have revealed the same truths, but probably in a different language or a different occasion. So that's one point where I think that there is some sort of an interplay between revelation and, human mind or human endeavor, human investigative efforts, asking the manifestation for guidance and then receiving it in a form that is adapted to the addressee's intellectual horizon, if you wish, so to the ideas, to the concepts, to the terminology, to the language that people are used to, and the manifestation of God. This is according to both the Bab and Baha'u'llah, Baha'i theology, if you wish. This is a major topic, that they reveal the truth in a language that is adapted to the hearer's understanding. So we always need to keep that in mind when studying individual writings, and this is holds particularly true for the writings of the Bab and for his early writings. Another point of interest, as sort of these introductory remarks, I would like to add that in the learned circles of the time, in the debates that were going on between the Shiite clerics and learned, and particularly the Shaykhi followers, I'll get to that in a minute, they put particular emphasis on knowledge. They saw knowledge as a sign of true greatness and of truth. And sometimes even as a proof of divine assistance. So that means in practice that if someone asked the Bab, and not only the Bab, but they would also ask, just learned people of prominence, Sheikh Ahmad, for example, Sayyid Qasem, and other figures of the time, their students would ask them questions about, say, an obscure hadith, an obscure saying attributed to one of the Imáms, which was, quite odd content-wise, and also not really authenticated or anything. But here the authenticity would not be relevant. This was not just a question that was being put forth to gain understanding. It was also sort of a test. They would test these spiritual leaders, if you wish. They would ask particularly complicated or obscure questions, and then it was considered an art to reply to these questions. You could not just say, well, this question doesn't make any sense, or, well, the text you ask about isn't even authentic, I'm not going to comment on it. Rather, they would think that you'd have to come up with a very original and innovative approach and well, you could say a hermeneutical perspective, a way of explaining even such an obscure text in a way that makes perfect sense and offers fresh insight. And that would be the second precondition, apart from the content and the arguments to offer. You have to be able to do it quickly, spontaneously. Not just go there and go read books for a year and then come back with a reply, but actually just, give the answer right away. So this is very vital, I think, to understand many of the writings of the Bab and the way they were revealed. And we'll get to that in a minute when we get to this particular tablet that is the main topic today. Now, the one particular very important current in Shiite Islam that is, well, deeply connected with the early days of the faith and of the Baha'i revelation is obviously the Shaykhi movement. You could say it's a current or a movement inside Shiite Islam. And it goes back to the ideas of Shaykh Ahmad As-Sa'i and Sayyid Kazim Rashdi. We've heard all kinds of stories. We've read about them in the Dawnbreakers and in Baha'i literature and so on. But their own teachings and the impact they had on their contemporaries and so on is still very much neglected and understudied. And the reason for that is that the literature, they've written thousands of pages and they have survived, but they hadn't been available. I remember when writing my thesis in the early 2000s, one of the major problems, besides obtaining manuscripts of the Bab's writings, was also obtaining manuscripts of the two sheikhs, of Shaykh Ahmad and Sayyid, because I pretty early discovered that in order to make sense out of much of what the Bab says, because it was addressed to sheikhis, because it was employing their terminology and their ideas and so on, I'd have to get some basic understanding of Shaykhism. So I tried to obtain those writings, and it was very difficult. Some of them had been printed in the 19th century, in the mid-19th century, and they were not only hard to obtain, but once you had obtained them, they were also particularly difficult to read and decipher. Now, this fortunately belongs to the past now. During the last 10, 15, 20 years, there has been many endeavors to publish Shaykhi writings in new, beautiful editions in different places in the Arab world. So Shaykhis are still active today. This is a short compilation. It's called Asrar al-Imam al-Mahdi, the mysteries of the Promised One, you could say. This is a compilation of Shaykh Ahmad and Sayyid Kazem's sayings and writings, well, just writings, not sayings actually. And then also the complete works of Shaykh Ahmad As-Sa'i have been published under the name of Jawami' al-Kalim. It's a 9-volume massive edition of Shaykhi works. I'll just hold that into the camera. You don't need to read it, you just need to see that, it's a nice legible version. And the same has been done with the complete works of Sayyid Kazim al-Rashdi in 15 volumes, Jawahir al-Hikam. Again, you can see that this is a near complete edition of the Shaykhi text. So now we're much better off when we want to learn about the doctrine and the teachings of the Shaykhis and to inform ourselves about the immediate background of the early believers. The letters of the living and most of the very early believers came from a Shaykhi background. So this is very fascinating, and I'm looking forward to working on that in the future and gain much better and newer insights, hopefully. Just to mention one minor thing that's very fascinating, and I haven't had time to look into it yet, but this collection has lectures, transcripts of lectures that Sayyid Kazim gave during Ramadan in the early 1840s. So this is very close to the Bab's revelation. It would be interesting to see what he was teaching to his students by that time. Anyway, the early writings of the Bab, to some extent, because they have been addressed to Shaykhis, the Bab addressed the letters of the living, as I mentioned, early believers. He also wrote to the Shaykhi leaders of the time, making known his claim to them, to Karim Khan Kermani, Mirza Mohit Kermani, and so on. Most of them did not accept his claim. But the writings of the Bab can, to some extent, if you just look at the outer form of the text, the outward form of the text, it can be understood to some extent even as Shaykhi texts. Of course, they're not just merely Shaykhi texts, but to some extent they appear to be. So much for some of the background of the Bab's early writings and to the extent to which they're, couched in the language of the time. Now, for this particular treatise, the tablet, or the treatise, it's called in Arabic, giving proofs about Muhammad's specific prophethood, you could say, or a special prophethood, both is possible as a translation. The details, the occasion of this revelation have been given in the Dawnbreakers and in other sources of the time, so they're relatively well known. Let me just start by saying a few words about the addressee and the circumstances of revelation of this particular tablet, as recounted in the Dawnbreakers, and also give some information from, contemporary court chronicles and resources and diplomatic correspondence and so on, that helps us a little bit to understand who this person was, the governor of Isfahan, who is really the addressee of this treatise, by the name of Manuscript Khan, and he had the title Mu'tamad al-Dawla, which means something like the one, the one that enjoys the trust of the government trusts him, something like that. So this governor was a powerful representative of the state of the time. He was of Christian Armenian origin. He had been brought probably as a slave during one of the invasions, during one of the Russo-Persian wars. He had been brought from the Caucasus to the mainlands of Iran, and there he had made up his way up to becoming a high-ranking state representative or official, and he was governor of the Isfahan province by the time when the Bab revealed himself. So this was one of the more important provinces at the center of Iran, you could say. And this governor, Manuscript Khan, he was at the forefront of battling clerical influence and defending the state's authority against them. In Isfahan, in the late 1830s, so this is just a few years before the Bab revealed himself and before the Bab came to Isfahan, there was a particularly powerful clergyman by the name of Muhammad Bawir Shafti. He's also mentioned in the Dawnbreakers in passing in the early chapters. This man had basically challenged state authority, and he had established a reign of terror, you could say, in Isfahan for some time. That meant he had allied himself with local gangs and mobsters, and he employed their services whenever he passed a religious verdict on someone, declare him a non-believer. He had them carry out the verdict. Some people he would have killed himself. That's in all the biographies about him and those of his pupils. They take pride in it. They say he actually killed those people with his own hands, carrying out God's will. So at some point he had challenged the authority of the state, and he had actually, this had led to anarchy in the town, and the Shah of that time, he decides to send Mu'tamad al-Dawla, said governor, who is the addressee of this tablet, to Isfahan to restore peace and quiet. And he does so. He gets there and he relentlessly persecutes these mobsters, and he puts this sheikh, this mullah, under house arrest. So I'm just mentioning this to see that this man was at the forefront. He knew what the clerical interference in political power meant, and he had sensed it. He had immediate experience with it. And this gives us a sense of, or gives us some understanding of the significance. When the Bab comes to Isfahan, he writes to I mean, this is in the Dawnbreakers, as far as I remember. He writes to the governor and, tells him that he's approaching the town. And the governor, Mu'tamid Dole, welcomes the Bab. And he brings him to the house of the Imam Jum'eh, which is the, you could say, some sort of a top cleric, the Friday Imam, one of the most powerful, or the top cleric of the town by that time. So also an eventual personality. And then the following days and weeks, this governor, he invites senior clerics to the house of the Imam Jum'eh. He couldn't have invited them to his own place because they wouldn't have gone to, most probably, to a governor's residence, but they would go to their colleague's residence. They would owe him that as a matter of respect. So this was probably a strategic choice. So he would invite them there, and then he would have them sort of debate with the Bab. He would either himself or others would ask the Bab about some of these questions that I mentioned early on, theological problems or interpretation of Qur'anic surahs. And one day, this governor himself, he asks the Bab, in the presence of all these clerics, whether he could adduce rational proof or just proof for the prophethood of Muhammad. And the Bab asks whether he wants this reply in writing or an oral reply, and he says a written reply would be better because future generations or others would also benefit from it. And so the Bab takes up pen and paper, and he writes down this treatise within less than 2 hours, as it says in the Dawnbreakers. The subsequent fate of Manuscript, you know, that later on, the prime minister writes to Isfahan and he says, you have to bring the Bab to Tehran. And Manuscript knew that prime minister pretty well, and he didn't trust him, so he decided to hide the Bab in his own house. So the Bab is, for the remaining few months in Isfahan, he stays with the governor at his house, unbeknownst to anyone. And when the governor dies in, I think, February 1847, that's when the Bab is discovered, and he's supposed to be taken to Tehran, but we all know this from Baha'i history. Sort of in a last-minute change of mind occurs, and the prime minister has the Bab sent off to Marku, to that remote prison. We do not know if Manuscript Khan, this governor, had actually recognized the Bab. There's a passage in the Dawnbreakers that implies that, or says it pretty explicitly, that when Manuscript Khan had heard the Bab reveal this treatise, or he'd read it later on, he would have proclaimed that he hadn't really believed in Islam before. He had just outwardly, converted. But now reading this, hearing these proofs by the Bab, he now, in his heart, believes in the truth of Muhammad. It's hard to tell. I mean, this is just an oral report. There's nothing really in the writings to confirm this explicitly, but it's quite clear that the Bab praises him for having understood the truth or the reality of the Bab's claim, and he had offered his services with best intentions and out of love for the truth. It's highly dubious, I would say, that the governor actually really understood that text in the way that it was revealed. But he must have been impressed by the way the Bab revealed it, because, as I said, it just took him less than 2 hours to write this treatise. I mentioned earlier how this was supposed to be, or thought to be, a proof for someone's receiving divine assistance and having superior knowledge and intuition. So fortunately enough, in this case, there's actually the very manuscript that the Bab penned that night has survived, and it's in the hands of the International Baha'i Archive. And I have a sample page here that I can just show into the camera. I don't know if there's probably won't be able to see much of it, but just you can get an impression. And if you know Persian Arabic, I don't know if this is close enough, but you'll see that this is so-called revelation writing in the Bab's own hand. And it doesn't have any dots, for example. So it's hardly legible. So when we have a look at the manuscript history in this case, We have here what we would call an autograph, so really a copy that goes back to the author's very own hand. If we dig a bit into this manuscript history, I think we'll discover a couple of fascinating things about the process of revelation in the Bab's dispensation, and possibly also applies to the Baha'i, to Baha'u'llah's revelation. The text just taken as such is very hardly legible, and at places probably would be incomprehensible. Then, of course, we have later transcriptions of this text. Scribes would later on transcribe this manuscript and bring it into legible form, and then copy it and send it to the believers and so on. And we have a number of those manuscripts also. Now, when we compare all these later transcriptions with this earliest one, this is part of the work that I did for my thesis back then, we'll discover, for example, that all these later editions in certain aspects unanimously deviate from the original manuscript. In some places there have been, grammatical issues have been resolved, you could say. But this is not that the scribes just took the liberty and thought they should correct this text, because it goes further. You can see in all the later manuscripts, there are certain words that have been added, sometimes phrases, and sometimes even there's 2 or 3 paragraphs that are not in this original, first manuscript written by the Bab that night, but they apparently have been added at a later point to the manuscript. Also, the Bab quotes a large number of hadith, sayings of the prophets and Imáms, and in this first manuscript, autograph, he has just put a note, mahal al-hadith, which just means the hadith later on to be inserted here, but he doesn't say which one and so on. Later on, a number of hadith are inserted in there. Now, all this leads us, to cut it short, leads us to the conclusion, preliminary although, of course, that the first revelation or revealed text is sort of a draft. It's not necessarily the final version that the manifestation decides to send out to people. Am I still on the meeting? Just gives me something.
Yeah,
it just says left meeting. Sorry, just something popped up here. All right, sorry.
No, we're still
Okay, I'll just go on. Probably then this revelation writing was transcribed and then taken to the Bab again, and he himself supervised and instructed the scribes to produce some sort of a final draft or final version, and that version was the basis for later reproduction. So we'd have some sort of a revelation manuscript first, and then have a draft that's still under the supervision, edited by sort of the Bab in this case, and then further transcriptions would be produced from that. Now, this I think is particularly fascinating when it comes to the idea of revelation and whether, how the divine word is translated into human language and so on. Obviously, all of this is not conclusive. It's just based on a few observations on a very few manuscripts, but still we can look at it in terms of questions and just think about it. The background of the topic, why would someone ask for proofs of Muhammad's prophethood in an Islamic context? There's really a long tradition of, there's a genre in Islamic literature by the title of Dala'il al-Nubuwah, which means proofs of prophethood, you could say. The Quran itself quite clearly states that Muhammad does not perform any miracles, but that the Quran itself is the sole and primary miracle. Later theologians have stuck to that in the sense that they have always emphasized the Quran and the revealed word, but they have added dozens and hundreds of miracles and all sorts of stories and legends and so on to it. To some extent, the true biography of a historic Muhammad is buried under layers of all these later editions and myths and so on. But the Quran really is the major proof, which is thought to be inimitable. So the word of God is inimitable. This is a major argument in Islamic theology. and makes it the primary proof of the manifestation. Now, Sayyid Kazim al-Rashdi was asked to adduce at some point rational proofs for the prophethood of Muhammad by one of his colleagues, and this is a treatise that has survived and is now for the first time, I think, published. And when it says rational proofs, this does not mean, is not necessarily the same that what we would understand today as rational proofs or arguments. It's not a line of reasoning and arguments that, would be convincing to a modern skepticist or a modern or Western reader, and someone who does not share certain beliefs and premises and so on. It's more sort of a meditation on the deeper meanings and spiritual concepts of prophethood. It's sort of rather written for believers to deepen their belief than to convince anyone. I say that in advance because the Bab has also adopted the same approach. And over the years, I've been approached by friends here and they said, I'm in a discussion, interfaith dialogue and so on about Islam, and I'd like to know what proofs that the Bab had used. So sort of as if he was just instructing us to enter a discussion and then, have sort of a line of arguments that we could just adapt to current situation. And that I can say, I hope no one came to this webinar today hoping that you learn about this, because this is not what the Bab does in this particular tablet, nor anywhere else, to my knowledge. It's more of a meditation, and it really makes it very difficult. The fact that the Bab revealed the text under these circumstances in such a fashion and so with such speed sometimes makes it difficult to follow the reasoning, because sometimes the text is eruptive, just like the Quran is anyway, and elusive, and it's sometimes hard to follow the reasoning. I'll just give a very short summary of some of the major topics. One of the main topics is the question of knowledge. How do we gain knowledge? It's so-called epistemology. And of course, the principle of the unknowability of God is held up high, it's central. And this is followed then by the idea of God's self-disclosure. God discloses himself, reveals himself, and this leads to creation coming into being through God's will, because God wants to disclose himself. He wants to be known, and therefore creation comes into motion, into being. And now all these processes of self-revelation and so on take place, of course, in higher spheres, way beyond human understanding and beyond our reach. But at the same time, they're all mirrored in all the worlds of God. They're synchronous in a way. This is a central principle in the Bab's writings in general, and it has a history before that, which does not need to concern us now. They're all mirrored in this world. So this process of continuous self-revelation, this gradual unfoldment of the divine in this world, is in a way mirrored in this world. Sorry. And the Bab now says that the wise and the initiate, those that are endowed with keen insight, they will be able to behold this truth everywhere in creation. They will see signs of God's miraculous working and self-disclosure everywhere in this creation. And then he goes on to interpret the name of Muhammad, for example, letter by letter, by taking recourse to the numerical value, meme being 40, and then the second letter ha being 8, and so on. And he explains all kinds of metaphysical truths and connections by having recourse to these letters about Muhammad, then about Ali, his son-in-law, and later on vicegerent, the first Imam. According to Shiite belief, he would say that all these truths are reflected in the name of Muhammad, the name of his father, the name of his daughter Fatima, the number of wives the Prophet had, the number of children he had, the number of children that died, the number of children that survived. All of these are given a particular significance. The dates of birth and death of the Prophet, and then there's allusion to particular astronomic constellation. So all of this is giving us, is drawing the picture where this is a cosmological happening, the revelation of Muhammad, that took place at one particular point in time, and all this, the initiate, those who are endowed with divine insight, can gather all these from these numbers and so on, and letters and so on. I'm not going to lie to you. I have studied this text several times. I've revisited it every few years or so. I still wouldn't dare to claim to have understood the exact line of reasoning and some of the arguments that the Bab is giving here. But I'm looking forward one day to sitting at the feet of the likes of Nader Saidi or Stephen Lambden or Farid Rodmer to learn more about this. But for now, I have a few points of significance things that have caught my eye or have come to my mind that I'd like to share. One thing that caught my eye was that the Bab does not really speak about the historical Muhammad. He rather, speaks about this transcendent idea of a manifestation of the divine that came into the world at a particular time and in a particular form, under a particular name, and so on. But really, the core issue is that divine principle that is revealing itself. So he's not focusing on Muhammad as a historical person that would have done miracles, performed miracles, and so on, which is more the traditional Islamic approach, but he has a sort of transcendent view of Muhammad. And this, is, I think, really paving the way, preparing for the principle of manifestations of God and progressive revelation, which then is, of course, spelled out in the Persian Bayan and later on by Baha'u'llah in the Book of Certitude. So in a way, we could say that this treatise is more about the Bab than it is about Muhammad. It's the Bab's teachings couched in a language or just revealed for this occasion, a particular topic, but it really speaks about the Bab's own claim. And then if you revisit the text with this perspective, it becomes significant because he says that Muhammad is the bearer of the complete prophethood, and Ali, with this particular name, is the bearer of complete vicegerency, Valaya, which is also a central concept. And now, of course, the Bab's given name was also Ali Muhammad. So both of these, when he speaks about the significance and the numerological value of these letters, all of this can also be taken to really refer to himself. And then, of course, very central is the argument of divine verses. The Bab confirms this idea of Islamic theology that the real proof for the manifestation for Muhammad were the revelation of divine verses. But then there's hardly an early writing of the Bab that does not make this particular point that the Bab is now revealing verses. It starts from the Qaimul Asma and goes through all the writings, and he always challenges even the addressees, the clerics that he writes to, and says, I'm here, I'm unlearned, I'm uneducated by your standards, but I'm revealing these verses with such speed, unparalleled, and I'm ready to face you and challenge you anytime. And so this is actually what Mu'tamid ad-Dawla, the governor, had done when he was having the ulama come together with the Bab, and the Bab obviously delivered this treatise and made good on his promise. Now there's one, so I think this is the main idea that I got out of studying this, is that the Bab really does not speak about Muhammad and about topics that would belong to the past somehow, given that this is a new revelation, but he actually, is sort of in a subtle, almost subversive way is promoting his own new teaching, is preparing people for accepting his own claim. And there's one part at the end of this treatise in the current form, which is not in the very first manuscript. So there's a whole part that's added in all later manuscripts, which I think further confirms some of the ideas I had suggested early on. And this last part really speaks about what is called the fourth pillar of faith in Shaykhi belief. So you have God, you have the prophets, you have the Imáms, and then you have what is called the fourth pillar, which would be the perfect Shiite, or just to cut it short now because time is coming to an end, which would be the promised one. And he would be, the supreme divine manifestation according to the Bab. So in this last part of the treatise, the Bab makes it quite clear that he is this person. He is the recipient of divine verses. He has access to divine knowledge, unparalleled by anyone else in the history of Islam, and so on. This claim to divine assistance, and by that he establishes his own, divine, supreme authority, both doctrinally, because, like I said, you could read the text as really speaking about not the Muhammad and the Ali of the past, but the new manifestation of Muhammad Ali at this time, at this age. So both in terms of doctrine, but also in terms of the what I would call performance. So the very fact that he reveals these verses, he's just, without any preparations, he says himself, without having recourse to books and looking up things and so on, without thinking about it, without rewriting phrases and paragraphs and so on, as any human, ordinary human would do when writing such a treatise on such a topic. So just through the performance itself, already he's, presenting a claim that is probably the biggest challenge to clerics of the time. I think, Rob, time is up. So I have two more points that I'll just, if questions come up. Okay, so very short, just I think two main topics that we have in the writings of the Bab. This is sort of my attempt to summarize maybe the revelation of the Bab. Well, this is of course impossible, but I'm trying to identify two key themes that run through all the writings. One would be, as I mentioned earlier, the idea of knowledge. How does the feeble human mind obtain knowledge about the divine? And this is then, of course, brings all the ideas of manifestation and God's self-revelation and so on. This is one topic, knowledge and epistemology. And the second would be expectation. So waiting for a promised one. And these are different in the early and in the later writings, but the theme of expectation is addressed in different ways, but it runs through the early and the later writings. And all of these now in the immediate Shiite context, they are both related to the idea of authority, of both spiritual leadership and political leadership. So the Bab's mission was, I think, to challenge existing notions and to shatter structures and institutions. So when he was putting forth his claim, he was provoking, obviously, the mullahs, but also the state, the Shah. And there are two short quotations by The Guardian that I think support this idea. One is from God Passes By, and it's quoted also in the notes to the Kitab al-Aqdas. This is note number 158. And the Bab says, Shaykhi Effendi says that the laws of the Bab were calculated to awaken from their age-long torpor the clergy and the people, and to administer a sudden and fatal blow to obsolete and corrupt institutions. And there's another quotation, also by Shaykhi Effendi, where he says that the Babi dispensation was essentially in the nature of a religious and indeed social revolution. The drastic measures enforced by the Bab and his followers were taken with the view of undermining the very foundations of Shi'i orthodoxy, and thus paving the way for the coming of Baha'u'llah. So I think if we look at the writings of the Bab, in a way, we might not even have to look for specific doctrines or social principles or teaching and so on, because they would have been spelled out later on by Baha'u'llah. The Bab was really there, as it says here, to pave the way, to prepare the way to provoke and encourage new ways of thinking, to shatter old convictions and traditions, to pave the way for new values, for new ideals, and so on. And then these were later on spelled out by Baha'u'llah, of course. So the Bab did not have to speak about many of the social principles, but his mission was, when it says to pave the way and to shatter or to even deal a fatal blow to existing traditions, maybe this is a different perspective how we should approach the writings of the Bab and see how he engaged said institutions, how he revolutionized, long-held notions, traditions, convictions. So it's more about, and I think, if I understand correctly, this is also in part echoing what Todd Lawson has said here in several talks before, wonderful talks. The Bab really is not only what he says, but it's also the way how he says it, and the form in which he says it, and who he addresses it to, and so on. So it's also, much of it is, you could call, is the performance, which is revolutionary. So we should not be disappointed or dissatisfied if we look at one of these writings and we don't get, the ideas out of them, or the principles that we'd like to find in them: equality of men and women, harmony of religion and science, and so on. But it sounds, outwardly very Islamic and traditional, whereas if you read closer, we'll see that it's very subversive and revolutionary. I think if we approach the writings of Bob with that perspective, then we'll just get a different picture and different ideas. So thank you very much for now, and I stop here, and looking forward to any questions or comments, hopefully.
Excellent. Thanks, Armin. This reminds me very much of our conversation right before we got started, of course, about the whole question of the teachings of the Bab. Someone had actually, I think, written after Todd had given one of his talks and said, so what are the social teachings of the Bab? And we said, sorry, wrong question. That's not really the point. But at the same time, if you consider Tahereh's declaration, her declaration is breaking with Islam. It's subversive to the way Islam works, the way the traditions and the customs of Iranian society have developed, and it implies a new teaching. And there are other things about the Bab's teachings that also imply a different status for women in the bayan, I guess, in terms of the way they're to be treated. But he doesn't come out and say there's to be equality of men and women. He leaves that for Baha'u'llah. That's my understanding anyway. He sort of leaves the blank space for Baha'u'llah to fill in and builds around it, and then uses Tahereh's declaration in a way as the Babi community's one of the things to break the Babi faith from Islam.
Well, yeah, I mean, the Bab's teachings definitely are also, there are social teachings or teachings of social implications, broad social implications in the later writings from the Persian Bayan onwards. Also very concrete examples would be, the printing of books being a law, establishing publishing houses, printing of books, schools, a mailing system, communication system, all those sorts of things. These were addressing immediate needs of the time. So I don't, by no means want to say that the Bab's writings did not have social principles. Even the principle of non-violence, you could say, is found in the writings, or, universal peace is found in the Bab's writings if read from a certain perspective, but it's not spelled out as conclusively, as universally as it is spelled out by Baha'u'llah later on when he says he abolishes the sword. The Bab basically abolishes holy war, but he does so in a subversive and subtle way, in a way that if you could still misunderstand it. If you don't want to read it, you could still argue about it. Whereas Baha'u'llah, just makes it quite clear and explicit that the sword has been abolished. That's what I was trying to say. The Bab is preparing for it, but he's doing so in a subtle and subversive, sometimes I personally think even in a satirical way. He's employing, when he speaks about ritual purity and impurity, this is my favorite example. Shiite scholars, just very shortly, are obsessed with the idea of ritual impurity, and you shouldn't touch a ritual impure person, which is a non-believer, and so on, and how you can reinstate your purity. And then the Bab in the Persian Bayan also has a chapter on ritual purity, and he says this is pure, this is impure, and so on. But then he says that the believer and the word of God, they're purifying. So whatever comes in touch with the believer becomes pure. Now this is what I mean satirical, because it makes it obsolete, because all this, this fuss is about a believer losing his purity, but then you can't lose it anymore, there's no point. But still, he speaks about purity and impurity, he employs that language, whereas Baha'u'llah then at Rezvan, the first declaration, and then later on in Kitab Aghdaz, he says that, the concept of ritual uncleanliness is completely abolished. So he's very much more explicit, and the same you could say for, violence and militancy and so on.
Fantastic. I've got some questions here. Runa says, thank you for an interesting talk. Is there a typed up version or a readable copy of the manuscript on the nature and demonstrate the validity of Nubuwwate Khase that is available for us to read? Was it revealed in Arabic?
Yes, it was revealed in Arabic, and I think Runa could contact me later on, offline, and then I could probably send her a text or see if I can find it.
Right. Yeah. She's a student in the Writings of the Bab course that you're also in. So
that's right.
The two of you have contact. What language did Sayyid Kazem lecture in? Persian or Arabic, she says?
Well, these transcribed talks here are in Arabic. I suppose it would have been Arabic, this being in Karbala and, in Iraq, and this being the language of, the learned. It would have been in Arabic. And he must have been, he was of Persian descent, and he was fluent in Persian, but I think he spent most of his life in Arab countries and Saudi Arabia, mainly in Iraq, so he would have been just comfortable in Arabic speaking.
Sure. Sue says, this discussion is very helpful. We're currently studying the Dawnbreakers, the Kitab-i-Igan, and Gate of the Heart. It really is essential to know the soil from which the flowering of the Babi movement and the Baha'i faith arose. And let me see what we have here. Sue also says, revelation writing, that is such an intriguing thought. I have studied graphology, graphoanalysis, and graphotherapy as an adjunct to my practice of health and healing. Can you say more about the unique energy that distinguishes the Bab's writing from ordinary writing?
Well, I'm sorry. I think I cannot. I'd rather not try if I don't have anything meaningful to say, but I find it absolutely fascinating. What I know is just, this does not really have to do with the writing itself, but what the Bab says, that what makes the word of God inimitable, so not to be reproduced, is what he says. He makes this point in this particular Risala also, treatise. He says that, the Quran just consists of the same letters of the Arabic alphabet that any other Arabic text is written in. So there's an A and a B and so on. These are the same A's and B's. Yet the Aleph, the A, which is revealed in the Quran, is of a different nature than the Aleph that is written in any other text, because that particular letter has divine spirit, you could say, or divine power attached to it. So this is not exactly an answer to the question, but maybe still somehow related to that.
Oh, really? And revelation writing, you might want to explain the term, because it's basically a kind of shorthand, you might say.
That's true. Yeah, it's sort of a shorthand. In this particular case, when it's Arabic writing, Arabic, is you don't write the vowels, but you have to write the dots. If you don't put the dots, and there's so many letters that you could confuse. They're just differentiated through dots, one dot beneath or one dot, what do you say, on it, two dots. Yeah, exactly. So if you don't put any dots, then that makes it much more difficult, or probably in places impossible to read. But as you say, it's a shorthand. And then we know that the amanuensis of Baha'u'llah, he developed a shorthand that is even more difficult. That there's no way. Still, the writing of the Bab, you can decipher it, most of it with a lot of effort and so on. But the one that Mirza Rajan, the amanuensis of the Bab, had developed, and there are specimens of that are in the Revelation of Baha'u'llah, I think, in one of the volumes.
Yeah.
And one is, I think, on display at the Visitor Center and at the World Center. I think you can't really decipher any of it, which is why they had to transcribe it quite soon after hearing the text and then take it to Baha'u'llah and make sure that they had actually correctly. And this was something, in this case, that I think, the way I understood, that they had actually invented. So this is not sort of a shorthand that is common and that they knew, but this is a unique system of writing down the revelation, which came with such speed and was dictated to them with such speed, to be able to keep up with the speed.
So the Bab revealed the entire volume of this special Prophethood of Muhammad tablet in 2 hours. How many pages of text are we talking about? Can we get some sense of the length of the thing?
and this is what it says in the Dawnbreakers, less than 2 hours, and it says 50 pages. But these 50 pages, of course, this refers to the later transcriptions. This original here is about 11 to 13 pages.
But they're twice as long.
Yeah, because you see they're very long, yeah, and very dense writing. And this is about 80% of the text that we have in all these later versions. As I mentioned, there's a last part, which is, treating the idea of the fourth pillar and so on. This one is not included in this text. So if that had been part of it, it would have been 2 or 3 pages longer, supposedly.
Does the text cover the first 3 pillars then, and it just doesn't cover the 4th pillar?
Well, in a way, you could say so. Yes, in a way, it's not the structure. It does not, speak about first pillar, second, and so on. But all of these are covered there. It does speak about the Godhead, and then about the Prophet, and then towards the end about the Imáms. And this 4th pillar, this sort of perfect man, this promised one, that is really kept for the end.
Mm-hmm. Interesting. Let's see. Daniel says, was the Bab communicating in this and other writings in an understandable way to a general literate population, Persian Arab, or was it mostly accessible just to the Shaykhi community? I guess that's his question, yeah.
Well, I think you could say both is true. Especially the early writings, I would say, were not accessible to those with no, sort of firm background in the terminology and concepts and the way of perspectives of classical Shiite theology, and particularly Shaykhi. I mean, you don't have to be a Shaykhi to understand it, but you'd have to have some background in Shiite theology, I would say. I don't think that a general audience, and this again is distinct from the writings of Baha'u'llah and Abdullah, which are much more accessible and easier to understand, whereas the Bab was probably addressing these clerics in their own language, for the reasons I tried to spell out earlier. So I think that's why. So, yeah.
Dorcas asks about the bastinado. I don't remember you mentioning the bastinado. What is the significance of the bastinado?
Well, I don't think I managed it, but by this time, I'm not sure. I think the Bab received it, or was it in Shiraz? I'm not sure anyway, but it happens, and also Baha'u'llah later on received it, where it was just a way of punishment and humiliation at the same time, which is, when your feet were tied up and then they would slash, no, not slash, what do you say?
Beat.
Yeah, beat your feet. Until they were bloody, so you couldn't walk for a while. But really, I think it was very painful, but also it was a means of delivering humiliation for the victim. Yeah,
I don't remember how that came up. Let me see if there are other questions here. I don't see any others right offhand. Tell us how you decided to do your dissertation on this particular book, and what did your teachers think?
Well, the thing is, I was fascinated with the Bab from the beginning when I started discovering the faith and studying the faith in my youth. I was always fascinated with the Bab. And so later on, when I came to, go into this field of studies, I thought that I should, one of my thesis, master's or dissertation, something about the writings of the Bab, being not that accessible and well-known and so on. So this was really there from the beginning. It was a process. It was just at one point where I said, okay, I'm going to do this. And then I came across this Risala, which in a way also there were pragmatic, reasons, because it's sort of a text, unlike the Qayyum al-Asma, which is, 200-300 pages or sometimes 400, or the Persian Bayan, which is very voluminous. I thought this is about 40-50 pages, something that you can still treat in a meaningful way in the dissertation. And then, of course, there are so many references to Islamic traditions that you could also, see, argue for the relevance for Islamic studies, because it was a dissertation in Islamic studies. And this is also, my supervisor fascinated with it, because they knew about the Bab, obviously about Bab, isn't it? So not very much. And the fact that you have an autographed manuscript, and then you have all these later things, all this sort of was very, very fascinating to them. It was just became the perfect topic. And I was lucky enough that the World Center helped me with manuscripts and supported me in that aspect of the work, so I could have access to this particular manuscript and this, yeah. So this is how it came about.
It is you mentioned it's Isfahan period of the end of the early writings, or the middle period if you take Nader's classification scheme. Do you see in this particular tablet any, shall we call it, is it a transitional writing at all? In other words, is there any hint of what is to come in the later period, in the Bayan and later?
That's a very good question. I think when Nader was arguing for the middle period, he was saying that it's sort of slowly moving away from the more Islamic topics to a different way of. Now, you can look at this in both ways, and I try to point this out. In a way, it's still very Islamic because it, argues strongly for the supremacy of the Prophet Muhammad and him being unique and so on in one sense. On the other hand, you have the subtle subtext of the manifestation not being tied to one particular historic occasion, but being a more transcendent principle. So there you could say it's paving the way for the teaching of manifestations of God as then spelled out in the Persian Bayan. I haven't given it that much thought, but it's a fascinating question. I think, it's something one should keep in mind when studying it again, and also studying on different writings from that time, and see whether this is already present in earlier writings or not. I'm not sure right now, I have to admit.
Certainly, it's continuing some of the motifs of the early writings, in that the Bab, while he doesn't come out and declare himself a messenger of God, nevertheless is clearly revealing text.
Yes.
And that sounds like it's true in the tablet on the special Prophethood of Muhammad as well.
Yeah, in a way he says, I'm not laying claim to anything, and the law of Muhammad is still intact. No one is going to change, or no one has changed. He doesn't say no one's going to. He says no one has changed it, and so on. So it sounds very, devout Shi'i Muslim thing, but at the same time he says, I'm revealing verses, I'm receiving divine right, tantamount to the Quran in extent and in scope and in style and so on. So this must have been confusing also to some of the Bab's audience, but it's quite clear that his claim is already there.
How extensively does he quote the Quran in this particular tablet?
Well, indirectly, you could say it's all pervasive because it takes recourse to Quranic terminology all the time. But he doesn't quote. I mean, there's a couple of verses he quotes, but it's not quoting that many texts. There's a few hadith, but I mean, there's another text from the Shiraz period, the Tafsir al-Kawthar, which is the Surah 108 of the Quran. It's a very prominent Shiraz text, and there you have page after page where the Bab quotes traditions about the promised one. In this text, you don't. And I think the idea, I mentioned that he was asked to produce rational proof. In
right.
Islamic theology, when you say rational proof, usually the opposite is, you could say proof from narration or traditional proof, meaning traditional proof would just be, naql would just mean that you quote text, and by authority of the text, the matter is settled. Whereas rational proof just means that you would use these texts and also try to develop an argument and analyze them. And I think the Bab, in this case, he was asked to produce rational proof. So he was not just quoting, but he was, sort of meditating on them, I could say. And yeah.
So it sounds like it's a different kind of performance than in the Qayyum al-Asma, which is a lot more Quran saturated, I guess.
Oh, yeah. Yeah, it's very different. The Qayyum al-Asma, I think, stands out uniquely in all the writings of the Bab, but also especially in the early writings. Even though it's the first one revealed after his claim is put forth, it's very powerful, it's very direct, and then for about 2 years or so until the Persian Bayan, it seems like the Bab is sort of, holding back something that he had revealed right in the beginning. So outwardly, it becomes very, very pious Islamic and so on the outward, whereas the Qayyum al-Asma is the new Quran. Whereas this one here, for example, you could easily understand it if you don't have the background about the Bab. You just read it as some Islamic scholar having written a thesis on it. And you would be unaware of the subtext in that case. It could easily happen. So this is very different from the Qayyum al-Asma. That's true.
That's interesting. Neda says, very interesting in the Kitab Ruh. I don't remember you bringing up the Kitab Ruh. When you mentioned the Bab praising Muhammad Khan, I'm curious to know, is there if there was a correlation with this book.
Did I bring up the Kitab al-Ruh? I'm not sure. And Muhammad Khan, meaning, is this the Shah, Muhammad Shah, or
Muhammad Shah?
Muhammad Dawla, I think, right?
Yeah. Oh, yeah, maybe that's when you...
Referring to the governor?
Maybe. It's not clear here.
Oh, yeah, I mean, the Bab, maybe, I think it's probably referring to the governor, because that's where I said the Bab is praising him. So the governor, Manouchehr Khan, Mu'tamid al-Dawla, he was praised by the Bab. The Bab wrote a number of letters to the Shah, as we know, at least 6 or I think 7 letters. 7 times he addressed him. The first surah of the Paimalas were also addressed to the Shah, and 6 individual letters in 4 years. So, and also to the Prime Minister. And the Bab tells the Shah, do not worry. Although I'm endowed with this supreme divine authority, I haven't come to dethrone you. I don't want to lay claim, to lay hand on your throne. I also don't want to be like the mullahs, so you give me the right to, exercise religious authority. I'm just calling you to the truth. Accept it or don't, but don't worry, I'm not going to take away your throne. And then he goes on in these writings, so it's basically the same as what Baha'u'llah would say later on to Nasruddin Shah. And in this context, he says that now, this is one letter from the Mawku, it's one of the later letters, he complains to the Shah that, you have banished me rather than bringing me to your court and debating me and knowing about the truth. And he says that there have been people surrounding you, and they have been feeding you false information. They have been, misrepresenting my cause. Whereas the late, and he had died by that time, the late Manouchehr Khan, the governor of Isfahan, he had understood. Now, this is a question of translation. You could say he had Haqiqat Amr, which could be translated as the truth of the cause,
right?
Capital C, or it could just mean as a general thing, he had understood the true matter, just the true situation, or something more general. Can mean both. But he says that he had understood what this was about, and the context seems to say, the Bab said, well, Manouchehr Khan had understood, I'm not here to be just another mullah, someone who's abusing clerical or religious authority to gain political or financial power. This is not what I'm aiming at, and you should know the real enemies from your friends. In this context, he particularly singles out Mu'tamid al-Dawla, and he says how what he said to the Bab in private and so on, and we know all these from Baha'i history. So it's not entirely clear if he became a believer in the doctrinal or dogmatic sense, but the Bab says that he performed his duty, he fulfilled his duty towards us. So I think this is quite a clear statement. Yeah,
that's good. Yeah. John asked this question. You mentioned the 3 pillars and the 4th pillar, and why is the Quran not a pillar? You might want to say what the pillars are here in the case of...
So this is just... Yeah, that's true. Sorry. These are just ideas that, have been developed in theology. They're trying to systematize faith. What do you need to believe in? They're sort of articles of faith, you could say, and they're called pillars of religion. They're pillars of faith and pillars of religion and so on. These are systems that have been created by the divines over centuries. And so what would make you a true believer? You'd have to have these 3 pillars in that case, which would be, you have to believe in God, in one God, you have to believe in the prophets of God, and you'd have to believe in the Imáms. And others would add, traditional Shiite belief would add that you have to believe in God's justice and you have to believe in resurrection and judgment day. Now the Shaykhis would say that divine justice is really just part of divinity. So this is just subsumed under believing in God. And judgment day is something that we know about through prophecy. So this can also be subsumed under prophecy. So that leaves us with 3. Whereas we have to add, someone has to be there now that there's no prophet and the Imam is in occultation. Divine guidance has to keep flowing and has to be accessible. This is now a deviation from classical Shia theology. So we have to believe that there's always a representative of the Imam that can be reached by the believers. This is the promised one. And this is why the Shaykhis were looking for an intermediate or someone who is in touch with the Imam, whereas according to classical Shia doctrine, just the Imam himself would come. They did not expect a Bab or anything. So this is why the Bab's claim made sense to the Shaykhis more than to all the other Shi'is, because they had this idea that to these three pillars, you add a fourth one. You have to believe, you have to develop a spiritual relationship with the occult Imam that everyone is awaiting. You can't just sit there and wait for him to appear sometime in the future. You have to be in touch with him. This is really, in a nutshell, what this doctrine of a fourth Imam, of a fourth pillar stands for. It's an article of faith, really, you could say.
It's kind of like the Sufi idea of the Ansana Kamel.
Exactly.
Yeah, which is a Sufi idea. That's very interesting.
From there, yeah.
Runa asks another question. Did the Bab address any tablets to Sunni clergy?
There's one letter he writes to the Sharif of Mecca, which, you're quite catching me off guard, but I suppose you must have been a Sunni, but I don't want to say anything wrong. I will look that up. It's a good question. Other than that, the Sharif of Mecca, I'm not aware of any. I mean, we know that he addressed the Sultan of the Ottoman Empire, and Nejati has translated this and worked on this, Nejati Al-Khan, but he's not a cleric, Sunni cleric. He's a Sunni ruler, but not a cleric. So other than that, I'm not aware of, but that, of course, doesn't mean that there isn't any.
But the Sharif certainly would have been a Sunni, but would he have been a cleric?
Yeah. So
it's not an honorary position given to an emir or something, I wonder.
That's what I would think, yeah. But it's been so long that I read this tab that I can't really tell you what's in it, so I can't really make a conclusive statement on that.
Paul asks this question. Does the Bab have anything to say about the doctrines of Mullah Sadra? It's pretty deep into Shiite.
Yes, well, Mullah Sadra, I can just say very shortly, is a very famous and very influential philosopher of around the 16th, 17th century. And he's been both praised and condemned, so he's always been a matter of dispute. He offered very fascinating, fresh insights into philosophy and theology. There's a school of thought attached to him and a few other famous personalities, the so-called school of Isfahan. And Sheikh Ahmad was influenced by that school. He has written about it. But Sheikh Ahmad, two of the major works of Sheikh Ahmad Ahsai are commentaries on major works of Mullah Sadra, two of his most voluminous writings, Sharh al-Shia and Sharh al-Mashail. But he really condemns Mullah Sadra. He has been a non-believer because, and this is the irony, he says that Mullah Sadra's teaching really comes to denial of physical resurrection on Judgment Day. Now, this is the same accusation that has been leveled against Sheikh Ahmad later on by the uncle of Tahireh, Balagani later on. He is the first to call Sheikh Ahmad to attack him and call him a non-believer on grounds of him denying, corporeal resurrection. So, of course, there are other reasons behind that. There's, a conflict behind the scenes and so on. But now, the main question was the Bab. He does mention it in the early writings, and usually he would quote what Sheikh Ahmad and Sayyid Kazim had said about Sheikh Ahmad, and even Ibn Arabi, Muhyiddin, and I haven't seen any commentary or writing by the Bab solely, exclusively addressed to issues about Mullah Sadra and the like. And mainly he seems to avoid getting too deep into these debates, I think. Bab is trying, to create something new, but to the extent that he had to, he did, give guidance or give his opinions, whatever you would say, in this on these issues. But I haven't seen anything, explicitly, extensively treating Mullah Sadra beyond, some quotations by Sheikh Ahmad.
Interesting. Sort of parallel with Baha'u'llah's tablet to Manekji Sahib, when Manekji asks all kinds of questions about the Mahabad prophets and stuff, and Baha'u'llah says, be anxiously concerned about the world you live in.
Exactly. So the Bab did not do it to that extent. I mean, we see how much he employed the language and how much he adapted his writings to that sort of discourse and so on. But, I mean, there's some things that are very prominent in Shaykhi writings, this idea of a spiritual intermediate world, the Havar Ghalya or Hur Ghalya, no one really knows how it's pronounced correctly, and so on. So I haven't seen any reference whatsoever in the Bab's writings. Maybe there's one somewhere, but it certainly isn't a very prominent concept. So he does not. So this just goes only so far that the Bab. So which also proves that he wasn't really a Shaykhi. The Bab's thinking, transcended this. He was way above it, but he. Well, in order to make himself understandable to his immediate audience, that's why he adopted their language to that extent. That's my understanding anyway.
Well, we certainly have gone quite far today into all kinds of other issues, and relating this particular tablet to Shaykhis and to Mullah Sadra and to the Quran and to the Bayom al-Asma and to the Bayan and everything. So we don't have any other questions, so I want to thank you very much for this really fascinating discussion, and I'm sure our audience will have much to think about for a while, and we'll have people watching this for years and pondering it and thanking you again and again and again.
Thank you very much.
I want to thank you again, Armin, for this opportunity today for us to hear about this tablet, about the special prophethood of Muhammad, and we look forward to hearing you some other time as well.
Thank you very much. Looking forward to it.
So I want to thank everybody for watching today, and I hope they enjoy the rest of their weekend, and we will see you again in November, unless we have a special talk in October related to the bicentenary of the birth of the Bab, which we may manage to do yet. I don't know. So until then, I thank everybody and see you again on the web.
Thank you very much.